fucking problems.
Yeah.
And comparing myself to them, like, fuck you, look at me.
Yeah.
And it's fucking toxic. And
Yes.
I know I was doing it. And I
Yeah.
know, you know, use an example of, you know, a teammate dying overseas who you worked on. You know, no one's ever saying that's not traumatic as hell for you, but that also doesn't mean people come back and be like, well, fuck your society. And I know I've struggled with it massively, man, especially with, you know, different experiences I've had of like, well, how can you march down this street and say this, and I've seen this, and I've done this, and this happened to me? Well, no, like that's my personal experiences, and this matters to them.
Yes.
And I've had to take on this new stance, and I know I was lost in the mix when I was doing it, but well, just because of what's happening to me or someone else doesn't mean your problems don't still matter.
Yep.
The way some things affect some people is as significant as others. We all react to things differently. But I went through a fucking toxic phase, man, of like, oh, fuck, I broke up with my missus, I feel bad. And my response wouldn't be, fuck, man, you're right. It'd be, well, at least you don't have fucking cancer. I still throw that out occasionally, but just taking the piss with the boys. But like, I honestly believed it, man. I honestly believed, fuck you, stop complaining. And that was toxic. I know I've ruined friendships over it. And it's a hard thing for us to come back to.
I hear what you're saying, and it's, I mean, that is the ultimate trump card, though. The old boom.
You should see me go.
I see your parking fine, and I raise you brain cancer.
That's me. That's me every time I want to go to the pub with the boys. So I was telling you yesterday when we won the beers. I went. The boys like, oh look, I don't want to drink on a Thursday, And I went. I was like, hey boys, I don't know how many more Thursdays I've got left.
You're a son of a bitch.
It works well.
Awesome,
man.
though. Yeah, well played. But no, I hear what you're saying there, and I experienced a similar thing. That when I realised it, it was like this weight lifted off me, and it was almost, and it's sort of I'm somewhat ashamed to say it, but I mean I almost felt like I had this entitlement, like I was owed something when I got out of the army, and I don't exactly know what that something was, whether it was respect or status, or you know, they're probably the same thing. But I mean, I just felt, and I also, you know, I went through stages where I didn't want to tell anyone anything, and I just sort of thought I'd bottle it up and write it out. And then there was other stages where I thought maybe it'd be useful to reach out and tell people some of my experiences. But then my attempts to do that, they weren't being met with the response that I thought was appropriate for the story I was telling. And that sort of pissed me off. I'm thinking, you know, how dare you not respond with more emotion to this story that you can see is sort of, and I went along like this for a while, and like you say, getting a bit sort of pissed off as if I was owed something or somehow I was special. And I had this somewhat with my wife as well. Like I was trying to let her in on some of the stuff that had gone on so that she could appreciate, you know, why it was taking a little while to kind of get used to being out of the army or used to being home. And she couldn't get it, and I could see that, and that would piss me off because I sort of interpreted that as her not really sort of taking it seriously. And then I just realised on one occasion that I wasn't owed a fucking thing for a start. I had this realisation, no, hang on a second, how dare you be so arrogant to think that society owes you anything? That the people that I'd tried to you know, tell stuff to who didn't show the response that I thought they should, simply couldn't show that response because they haven't experienced it. Just like I haven't experienced their trauma. Everyone's had trauma, and exactly as you say, it's not a competition. It's not about whose trauma's the best, they win, and they should be the one that gets the pity. It's all relative to your lived experience. And so, I mean, if you live I use the term often, but I mean a first world middle class existence, and then your trauma is calibrated by that. So witnessing a car crash where someone's bleeding terribly or has had a sort of significant injury, or I see a dead body on the side of the road, that's hugely traumatic for that person. And that proportionate to their life experience and to the resilience they have built against trauma, that's a devastating experience. And so that will have the impact on them that would be equivalent to, you know, say my situation where I'd had a lot of training, had built a lot of sort of skill sets to be able to deal with a higher level of trauma, and dead body on the side of the road for me would be no worries. But you know, this other stuff, that's traumatic for me, and everyone's different, you know. And so it's this realization that I had at some point there a few years after I got out of the military that I wasn't owed anything, that and one of the things that I sort of ruminated on that made me come to this realization was thinking of a bloke who had come to one of the military units I was with, who had been a professional footballer before he came into the army. And so he'd come in, really good guy, and he ended up doing selection, going over to SASR. He's still there. I actually saw him, bumped into him in Tasmania a couple of months ago. He was down there on a course, and I was there doing. Anyway, he came into the army, so he'd been this pro football player in New South Wales. He was a rugby league player, and so he turns up, and he was a big deal in the footy world. Some people knew who he was, some people didn't know who he was, but the story being, he turns up in this unit and he's got a little bit of novelty, and people appreciated that. However, he needed to prove himself as a soldier, which he did, and he took that on. He took that on really well. He didn't come in with any ego. He came in and accepted that he was a private soldier day one at this infantry unit, and that's where he started. And then he built himself from there and became outstanding recon soldier in infantry selection SASR. And this sort of, you know, when I came to think about it, that's no different to me. I'd done this. I'd had this opportunity to operate at a high level in the army, and then I pop out and I'm a civilian doctor. The fact that I did that over in the army should have no bearing on that. I need to now establish myself and prove myself again in that world. It doesn't entitle me to all of a sudden jump up 10 rungs of the ladder. I got to hop on the bottom rung and work my way up because I'm in a new environment now. And which was that opportunity I had in Queensland to start building that skill set up and reestablish myself. But just that sort of realization that I'm not owed anything, that people who I am trying to tell stuff can't appreciate it, and it's not their fault. It's not that they don't want to, or they're trying to trivialize or diminish my experiences. They just can't possibly get it for the simple fact that they didn't live it, just like I haven't lived any of their trauma. I couldn't understand theirs. And like you say, their trauma is real to them. Yeah. Just like my trauma is real to me. And it's not a contest. And as soon as I realized that, it was like, wow, I get it now. I can move forward. But it took a while.
It does, man. That sort of thinking you're owed something off the universe doesn't know you fucking shit. And I know probably one of the most toxic things I had, and this was at least 6 months. I couldn't watch any news on TV because fucking anything, to be honest, because I'd watch the news and Channel 10 or Channel 9 or whatever would, and such has been arrested for being a pedophile or a murderer. And I'm like, they're 60 years old. I'll be lucky to be 25, 30. You fucking piece of shit. How come I get this life sentence and you'll go to jail for 10 years for living a life of crime? And I had to come to the realization of, well, but what they've done has no bearing on me, and what I've done has no bearing on them. And you're not deserved of anything. I'm not owed anything. Like, and Christopher Hitchens, who I'm a big reader of and a big fan of, it's fucking photos on my wall. But his final book, and his last, so he writes, and it's actually funny when you read it. And I'll sort of spoil it a bit here for you, but it pretty much just ends at a chapter, and you're like, oh, that chapter didn't feel ended. And then the next chapter is written by his wife, and the last one by his student, and he died of throat and lung cancer. Anyway, his whole book, his whole stand is on how you're not, like, through his cancer diagnosis, I'm not owed anything. And people with cancer tend to do a lot of the why me. And he asked the question back in a couple of chapters, why not me? What have I done to deserve to not have this that everyone else has? And he was like, why not me? He's like, well, I'm in a chemo clinic as a 65-year-old man next to a 6-month-old kid with cancer. Well, it's easy to say, why me? It's more easy for him to say, why me? Why not me? And it's true. And it's one of those, I think not being owed something is a pretty grim realization, but you'd be fucking happier once you've realized it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, because you can carry that around, or you can let it go. I mean, and ultimately, the choice is yours for any of this stuff. It doesn't seem like it is a lot of the time, but it is.
Yeah, and it's a choice to, take action against something or not, and it's a choice to do basically anything you want. At some point, you make the decision.
Yeah.
And, putting yourself out there, one of my big things, you never regret things you really try, you really put effort into. And you talk about this in your book a lot of like, you're better off trying something and not succeeding at it. And you may be trying something and then change the path, and that's fine, but never doing it isn't right. And you break down, and I can't remember the acronym you used for planning.
Oh, so that's SMART goals.
SMART goals.
Yeah,
it is SMART? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the setting goals and achieving them. But almost the funniest thing that I read into that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's not about, so your SMART goal might be to be an SAS trooper. That whole SMART planning doesn't have a step of, okay, then you're this trooper. It's preparing yourself to give yourself the best opportunity to become that. Yeah. And if you properly plan that correctly and you still don't make it, then I've done everything within my power to do it, and it hasn't, something along the line hasn't gone right. Yeah. Or if you're doing it and think, well, actually, I want to be here, then that's all right to do as well.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're exactly right. I mean, that whole SMART goal thing is just about, and that's certainly not my thoughts. I couldn't tell you who came up with that, but I mean, it's something that I've sort of reiterated. But it's just about defining that goal rather than having this loose pie in the sky dream to be an astronaut or whatever else. It's about breaking that down and making it specific, measurable. And the list goes on in terms of the acronym. However, it's just defining that goal. But the point that I kind of convey there is you need to set those goals and move towards them. But whether you actually get to that end point, ideally you do, because that's what you started on the trajectory for. But it may be that you don't quite end up there, or you end up going down a different pathway, or things don't play out as you plan, or you give it your best shot and you just couldn't get there. But I suppose my overwhelming ethos is to not die wondering, to be honest with you. And that was from a triathlon perspective, whilst I did not achieve anywhere near the level that I had aspired to there, I can look back now as a 42-year-old, now that window's closed. I mean, there's no way I could go back now and try and become a professional athlete. That's just the reality of it. But I can look back and say, honestly, that at that time in my life, I gave it my best and it didn't eventuate. And I'm not looking back thinking, geez, I wonder if I could have. And same with the whole SAS piece. So I look back now and think, yeah, that was fantastic. I gave it a go. I got on the course, got through, did that, spent some time there. Didn't achieve all my objectives within special operations. However, achieved most of them. And so, but I'm not looking back thinking, geez, I wonder if I could have done selection, And so but by that same token, and I do mention it as well in the book, there's stuff that I've started that I gave a decent shot to, and then I could see as I went along, it just was not the right thing for me. And so I think this idea of failure and quitting that have got such negative connotations in sort of modern society, quitting particularly, I think quitting's clever in terms of if you've given something a really good go and you're obviously not going to achieve the level you wanted, or you're not headed in the direction that you wanted, and that's clear, then, quitting's clever, and putting that energy into something different that you can achieve is useful. Or if it becomes clear as you go along that it just isn't where you want to go. And I'd started a Master of Policing, Intelligence and Counterterrorism at one point. And I got a year into that. And as I went through that year, I did the subjects, and I really wasn't particularly enjoying it. I was doing okay and it was all right, but I wasn't loving it. I wasn't engaged. And in that year, I was starting to look at what direction that might head in terms of occupation. I was starting to sort of talk to a few people in the intelligence communities and see what they're doing and what they're up to and what was going on, which was where I thought I might want to go when I got out of the army. And it occurred to me, hey, this isn't what I want to do. This is not aligned with where I want to go in life. And so I cut that course, and in effect I threw away however many grand in tuition fees and burnt a year of my life. And I've never used those skills that I learnt again or any of that sort of knowledge. But it wasn't where I wanted to go. I could see that clearly, and after a year, so I cut it and then started to look towards the MBA, which has been a fantastic qualification for me, and it's opened a lot of doors, and it's given me a skill set that's been really useful to me. So it's sort of it allowed me to free up the bandwidth to go and do that. Whereas if I had just blindly plugged on with it for 2 more years because I didn't want to quit it, I would have wasted that time where I could have been allocating that energy elsewhere.
Yeah, and you speak of the MBA being a fantastic thing you've really used, like you've really flexed that muscle. In the pretty much the opener of your book, you talk about like, well, now I own a Ferrari and a Lamborghini, and this, and I just remember reading it like, settle down, mate. Like,
it sounds grandiose.
It has to have a bit of a staunch on me in the beginning, but at the same time, then you sort of go into, well, actually, it doesn't just rock up. I fucking worked hard for this.
Yeah. Oh, no, for sure. And I guess anything in life, I think, for the most part, is achievable. However, I think it's generally these ambitious goals are simple but not easy, I think is a good way of putting it. I mean, they're simple in the fact that if you map them out and then just work your ass off, and you are willing to work harder than the bloke next to you for months, years, you can get to those goals. I really believe that in most things in life, that they are achievable for most people if you're willing to work for it. And like I said, it's a simple equation. It's just set goal and break it down into little chunks, chip away at them, and make the sacrifice, and you can get there. But it's not easy, and that's why most people don't do it.
Yeah, it's fucking
it's easier not to.
And it's very similar to, and you mentioned him in your book too, Gary V. His name, I can't remember his bloody last name. Vaynerchuk. That's it. Fucking good Instagram too.
Yeah.
And it's actually funny. He talks about the sort of new generation of entrepreneurs are not grinding like he's like they're fake. Yeah. He's like, they want that end goal, so they're on Instagram with a photo of a G-Wagon and a Louis Vuitton bag and a this and that. But he's like, they've never done the grind. He's like, it's all fucking fake. It's just fabricated. Yeah. They haven't been that behind the scenes grind, and it's easy. I forgot who it was. I think it was a boxer who won a fight, and I was like, oh, is he the easiest $10 million in 17 seconds? And he's like, well, actually, if you break, and you mentioned very similar to this in your book, if you break down the 30 years of training before that, it's probably getting paid $8 an hour. For no guarantee of anything.
That's exactly right. And I think that's the real trap of social media. Your Instagrams, where you've got 1 minute to put something up, and this opportunity to filter your life to just put 1 minute snapshots of what you want other people to see. And it's false. And I guess the unsuspecting young person looking at that gets this false impression of who these people are and how they live. And I think what it doesn't allow is, of course, you're putting up that 1 minute, and like you say, the 17-second fight that they earn $10 million for, but you're not putting up that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that led to mastery of the skill. And exactly as you said, you hit the nail on the head, with no guarantee of any return for that. So, I mean, that is being invested day in, day out, hour in, hour out by these professionals. And that's in all realms. And, it's the same in the sporting realm. And I talk in the book about the special operations realm is this sort of murky world where you get snippets on social media or the news when something significant occurs and one of the SOCOM elements pops up. But what you don't see is the grind, and that sort of decades of hard work that goes into becoming the soldier that then busts their ass and gets to one of these units and then grinds for years to be proficient and maintain those skills, and then goes on operations and something goes well and it pops up on the news. Yeah,
it's very easy to watch those 3-minute videos on the SAS, jump out of the choppers and shit, and not to see what goes into the behind the scenes. And I'm not saying I understand that, but fucking hell,
I think you do. I mean, it's the same across the board. It's just that sort of that grind, and it's not. You see the shiny shit. You don't see the days and days of being cold and wet and thirsty and hungry and busting for a piss and airsick and seasick and all that sort of shit that goes into it, sitting on an airstrip waiting for a trigger to do whatever for days at a time. And so you just see the shiny shit and you get kind of.
We had an argument about this at work the other day with we were like, because there was an F-18 flying around base. We go, and the boys like, oh, it's the second best job. SAS is the first. And I'm like, nah, straight up. I reckon I'd put fighter pilots first because, one, they don't do any of the really bad shit. Like, yeah, the SAS looks real cool, but on the surface too, they hold the longest patrol in Afghan and all this other stuff that would suck. That dude is just sleeping, eating good food and flying a $50 million plane. Like, he's killing it. Like, I'm not saying he hasn't done the grind, but he doesn't do that much and anymore. Sucked. Like,
you know what?
I'd jump in that.
I remember I was talking to an Apache pilot overseas on one occasion, and he'd been in support of one of our operations, and I was saying to him, man, that must be so fucking cool. You're cruising around in this thing. 'Cause Apaches are cool things.
Cool as fuck.
They're cool to look at. They're cool when they're overhead. Everyone loves them, and they do their thing, and they drop missiles.
Not as cool as a tiger, but
when they fly. And I was talking to this bloke, and I said, man, you have got the best job. And he says, you know what? When we're up there, we are looking down on you guys, thinking what I wouldn't give to be down on the ground.
That's true.
One of those things. So it's one of those grass is always greener type things.
Oh yeah. Fucking hell. I remember I was say 10Ks into a Pezza one day. Field Pezza was always brilliant. And F-18 again came over in like a tail slide, and I'm like, well, fuck, I picked the wrong job, eh? Because that's originally what I wanted to do. I went through school to fly planes. I got scared away by the Rosso.
Yeah, sure.
Just hit all there, but fucking awesome. Good shit.
There's a surprising amount of, and I don't know if you've caught the podcast on the Unforgiving 60 on Ben's podcast of that F-18 pilot that had gone across and been a SAS troop commander, Robbo. And there's a surprising amount of F-18 drivers that end up over at SASR,
but it's elite either way. And I think I actually similarly spoke. I had dinner with Mark Donaldson a while back, and we spoke about the elitist of. You see so many successful businessmen like yourself who have come out of the SAS. Now they were going to be elite. The mindset of people who get in positions like that, be it fighter jets, SAS, and there's other jobs like that. They are going to be successful, whatever they put their mind to. So there are plenty of entrepreneurs. Say Elon Musk. No matter what you think of him, if he grew up with the passion to be in fucking the special operations, he's the type of guy that would have done it because he would have found any other fucking way to get there. And it seems like, I'm not surprised that there are F-18 pilots that in the SAS, and you'd probably find if fucking Danny Ricciardo grew up wanting to be in the SAS, he probably would have been as well. That it's that top 1%, like that bell curve of the bell curve we were talking about. That you're just that sort of dude.
I agree completely, and I think it's I guess it's just the way certain people are wired and the aptitude and the
commitment too.
Yeah, I guess there's that. And I suppose there's nature and nurture that play into all of that and circumstance. And like you say, I think there's a particular sort of person that's geared towards that. And exactly as you say, whether they happen to drift into motorsport and start driving a kart when they're 6 years old and end up as Ricardo or Schumacher, or whether they end up, running around with a bloody toy M16 and end up fucking commanding officer of the SAS regiment like my brother did, or they're driving a fast jet. I think you're quite right. It's a similar personality type. And something that struck me as I went through my study and did entrepreneurship as a university subject, which was just fantastic and really kind of gave me the appetite to launch some entrepreneurial ventures, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, is that personality profile that we associate with entrepreneurship is almost exactly the same as the personality profile of a special operations soldier, and that's that's comfortable with risk, works well in small teams with no guarantee of success, and all of this sort of stuff, willing to hang it out there, and work hard with limited reward, and it's with a really ambitious but unlikely endpoint. And there was you could sort of put that personality profile against both those occupations, and it fits both. And like you say, there's no shortage of ex special operations or military across the board in that for that manner that pop out of the military and are quite successful in the business world, and it's unsurprising when you look at it.
Yeah, oh fucking oath. We just need to get rid of 3 hour in the business world. Go to fucking any defence industries event. Like, what'd you do? I was 3. You're like, of course you fucking were. Fuck off. Mr. Hickey and everyone else. You're like, oh, get out of here. It's everywhere. First guy to tell you a parrot too.
Old faithful, hey?
Oh, fuck. I always take the piss out of Blair. I'll say to him, she's like, hey man, like, like what's the difference between like yourself and a bowler? What? Like you're both not airborne. Just be like, you're a prick.
That is cold.
Yeah, always amongst that. Always got to chuck out some bands to him.
Oh dear.
That's always how it goes. Now, we will touch on a little bit, and we've sort of skipped around a bit of your deployments overseas.
Oh yeah.
And I guess this is basically what, like the way before knowing you personally, I basically knew you as an operator doctor. That people are like, Jesus, that's a fucking quite a thing. Yeah. And your time overseas, and basically, I want to touch on like what your expectations were versus the reality of what those tours were.
Yeah. I mean, as we discussed earlier, I had this idea that I wanted to be a doctor with special operations from end of 2001, and then come 2009. I finally got that opportunity. So I'd gone and done the selection course. I'd bounced back to 5RAR, done the deployment to Timor. That got cut short, went to 2nd Commando Regiment and had the opportunity to deploy with the Special Operations Task Group pretty soon after that. So it was sort of this realization of my dream to be a doctor with special operations. And then shortly after that, it's like, guess what? You get to go overseas and be the doc. And because I'd done that selection course, it gave me this. I was in this fortunate position where I had this credibility I wouldn't have otherwise had, and I think I was a bit of a novelty act, dare I say. Like it was sort of just like, oh wow, this guy's interested in military stuff, not just being the doc. And so the company commander of the commando element that I was attached to, that ended up deploying with the SOTG, he was a great guy, and he was very interested in getting me involved and getting me out on the ground. He sort of identified that I had that interest, and then in the pre-deployment training gave me a lot of opportunities to prove that I was not going to be a liability out on the ground.
Yeah.
And so, which is, it's a concern with any of us, and I suppose none of us know how we're going to go until it happens. But anyway, he gave me a lot of opportunities to get out and about. And so my first trip to Afghanistan, that's exactly what happened. There was this expectation that I would go out with every mission, which I absolutely loved. It was fantastic. In those days, that was 2009, we were still doing a lot of vehicle-mounted stuff. The IED threat was there, but it wasn't as extreme as it became later. And so I was out and about constantly. That said, it wasn't as kinetic as future tours for me, in that we were operating mostly out of vehicles, which kept us mostly in Uruzgan province, fairly local, which was relatively calm at that point. So we'd get in semi-regular gunfights, but it certainly was nothing compared to my future tours when we were doing a lot of air mobile stuff down into Helmand province, where it was far more kinetic. But it was, in terms of my expectations, that first trip was just brilliant. I felt that I'd arrived. That was
really,
I was doing the job. I was on the ground. I was treating some casualties. But by that same token, we had a lot of near misses and a lot of good luck. There was people getting, the pistols shot off their kit and holes through their uniforms not hitting them, radios blown off, and and one bloke had a weapon shouldered and a bullet lodged in his magazine well, and all these sort of time and time again we were having these near misses. A couple of blokes got shot but not serious, and so I suppose it created a bit of a false sense of security. So we finished that rotation. We'd gone down into Helmand Province and had a couple of decent days fighting down there, and hadn't sustained any casualties, and so everything went well. It was a good rotation. We had no one killed, which was, with hindsight,
that's the definition of a good trip.
So everyone who we left with came home with us, and so I suppose after that one, that was my benchmark for what a rotation looked like, and I didn't know any different. And compared to my Timor trip, it was just off the charts. It was fantastic. And so I'd come back and then finished up my time at 2nd Commando, had finally gotten back across to SASR, and then pretty soon after I got back there, deployed again with them on my second tour. And it was in that trip that we started doing a whole bunch more fighting, and that was when we started to lose guys as a task group and have a whole stack more casualties. And that was, I suppose, the realization of the job, and that was when, if you like, the veneer came off it, and I sort of saw what it was for what it was.
Yeah, that was going to be the next question. Just, did it all sort of come down to earth when, fuck, we were flying in the clouds, and now we lost our first guy, and now, fuck, we are sort of skin and bones still.
And I think there was a couple of things. I think by that stage I was a few years into the job, and so that initial novelty of being able to wear a different uniform and grow a beard and grow long hair and all that,
the exact reason everyone goes through selection.
Well, initially it seems important, and then you realise pretty quickly that it's. And I remember the first time I spray painted an M4. I mean, the first time I got an M4 rather than a Steyr. That's a point, and then you're spray painting it, and you're thinking, Jesus, if I spray painted my rifle back at the battalion, I'd be
you'd still be on guard. You'd still be hanging out there.
Christ almighty, yeah. At age 42, I'd still be painting rocks out the front of headquarters. But so, I mean, all those things that with hindsight are ridiculously trivial. At the time, they signified that once again, I'd arrived at that sort of goal of mine, which had been a goal for a long time. And so that was great at the time. But come a few years in, when I was on my second trip, that initial shine of SOCOM had come off, and you'd recalibrated to that special operations environment, and it was fantastic. It was stimulating. It was great. Don't get me wrong, but it was no longer shiny. It was just your job.
Yeah.
And you realised that for all the good stuff, it was still fucking hard work, and it was tedious, and there was a lot of frustrations, even though they were significantly less than some other elements in the army. They were still there. And then once we started losing blokes, it was another realization that, hang on a sec, we're not bulletproof. Like this, and I think the other thing that kind of hit me the hardest was not only are we not bulletproof, but it's not that you're a good operator or a bad operator. You're just lucky or you're unlucky, and the blokes that were getting hit were some of our best guys, and they just were in circumstances that were just unlucky. They happened to step on something instead of stepping 2 centimeters to the right, and then they're dead. Or, a bullet goes through their head versus goes through their kit, And I think, you're getting shot at from a few hundred meters away, and the difference between that bullet hitting you and not is millimeters of aim or a breath of wind or these sort of things. And you start to think about that. And we had a couple of helicopter crashes, and I was in one helicopter that crashed after it had tried to extract us, and then couldn't gain altitude on the way out and crashed, and we all walked away from that. And then there was other helicopter crashes that killed multiple people on board and mangled the rest. And you start to think, shit, you know what? That's just dumb luck that I was on this one and not that one.
Yeah.
And so I think that realization, coupled with the fact that I was, as a family, we'd had another child just before my second trip. So I had one kid when I went away the first time, and then he was a few years old, and then we just had our second son about 10 days before I deployed on my second trip. And so on the home front, I knew my poor wife was sort of struggling to raise these kids. And here I was doing somewhat of a selfish job that I loved. Like, it was pretty much just a camping trip with my mates, a bit of hunting thrown in there. But, you know.
A bit of Hunger Games, actually.
Yeah, so yeah, along those lines. But as I went along and sort of into my second, third, fourth trips, the weight of that started to really occur to me that this isn't just about me. Like, if I get killed on operations, you know, I won't know anything of it, but I'm leaving behind a wife with a couple of young kids, eventually 3 young kids that they'll never know who I am. And, you know, the scales start to tip. The novelty starts to come off it. The excitement in terms of it being new and shiny and a steep learning curve started to flatten out. And all the while, the other side of the scales was, well, people are getting killed here. We're playing for keeps. You know, it's dumb luck whether it's them or me. It just depends on which helicopter you hopped on as to which one crashed and which one didn't. It's not.
Did you ever feel, though, like leaving, that you were almost being, you know, the most experienced medic on the ground with those guys, or one of the most experienced, that almost the feeling of I'm letting the guys down? Like, if I'm not there, who's looking after the guys?
You know, I didn't. I mean, in the early stage of my career, I had this, and once again, with hindsight, probably pretty arrogantly, I had this idea that I should be the guy there because I'm the highest trained bloke and I'm going to give the person on the ground the best chance of survival. And it wasn't until my third trip when it occurred to me that that's not the case, that I was, in my mind, massively underestimating the competence of the medics around me. Yeah. And that was a real fault. And I'm sort of, you know, I'm embarrassed to admit that. And there was a couple of situations that happened on that rotation that made me realize this. And there was 2 specific jobs where I'd been on them, and the task group had been allocated 2 different missions on the same day. One was there was a mission against what they deemed to be a strategic communications tower over near the Pakistani border. And it was, the intelligence suggested that it was going to be heavily guarded, and it was a night mission. It was a winter job. And so anyway, long story short, there was that job. There was another job, which was a more routine vehicle-mounted patrol. I put myself on the high-risk thing, thinking that we were expecting casualties. Turns out we got in and out, and there was not a single shot fired. And the other job had a massive incident with one of their vehicles and a bloke critically injured. And the medic that responded to that did a brilliant job. Saved this guy's life, stabilised him, aeromedically evacuated him, got him back, and did it as well as, if not better than I could have. That was job one. The other one was a job where I had been on once again, a separate mission. I'd gone, done a thing, come back. We had another element out that was going against a Taliban heroin processing facility, and that had been rigged to blow. It was full of IEDs. The Talibs knew that we were going to come in and raid this thing eventually, so they'd rigged it, armed it as they went out the door. Our crew rolled in that night, got in there, started to sort of set the place to destroy all their stuff, and then someone initiated an IED, absolutely shredded one of our blokes, dropped him. The remaining crew fell back as they did, and then searched their way back in to make sure they were clear they weren't going to hit another device. By the time they got there, the guy that had been hit was showing no signs of life. One of my other medics was on the ground, and he responded, did his sequence perfectly, identified this guy had a thing called a tension pneumothorax, build up of pressure in his chest, and needled that, did another series of interventions, gave him an injection of a thing called tranexamic acid, which was the first time this stuff had been used in the field. It was just after we got approval to use it. And that stuff, in essence, reduces internal bleeding, is sort of the gist of what it does. But did these interventions perfectly, unquestionably saved this guy's life. And it was after those 2 events in pretty quick succession that it occurred to me, hang on a sec, need to be on the ground. And not only that, as I said before, I am underselling these blokes that are working, that are working under my command. These guys can do this job. And at that stage, I realized that my best utility was not necessarily trying to be on every single job to be the guy there, but to make sure that I was ramping up as much training for as many people as I could as this force multiplier, because I started to see that a well-trained medic could do exactly what I could do, and that I wasn't as important as I thought I was previously, which was a good realization. And so, I mean, to come back to your question of did I feel like I was sort of letting the place down when I left? No, because I knew that these guys were incredibly competent and would be able to continue to operate without me there, and that I wasn't fundamental to that construct at all. They were the blokes that were fundamental, and the medical officer could come and go, and they had that core competence.
It says a lot about the unit when you can look, fuck, I had faith. And look, to be honest, the amount of times you hear of CFAs, AFAs, everyone, because everyone's AFA, of course, but then CFAs and stuff doing some stuff, you're like, holy shit. Like, of course, it's within their realm. So a lot to give a guy, and like, I remember doing needle T training and being like, it's a lot to give something like that. Like, that's years at fucking med school or anything for someone else to do that. Here you go, here's this needle that's 6 inches long or 8 inches long. If this happens, you see these signs, do it. And my very limited knowledge is almost... I remember doing my AMT course before deploying, and some of the nursing officers, medical officers, almost overthought some things. Like because of the skills we had, we had basic resuscitation, tension pneumothorax, so could administer a few drugs, and that was it. We'd drag someone in and go, okay, one side of the chest isn't lifting. I'm doing this. Needle. Where we almost had to reiterate to some people, like, well, this is all we can do. Like, oh, let's do a chest drain and this and that. And it was almost like, it was fucking brilliant. Of course, way better medicine, but it almost, the guys, the sort of, if you just know the specific steps and fuck it, like, just do it. And some of the stories of guys on the ground from, or every call, everything in Afghan was fucking amazing. Some of the shit that went down. And from, I think sometimes, and this is a bit of bias from me, but we almost put the special forces units in such a spotlight, and that's fantastic, as we should. But I think for infantry guys and everyone else attached, we shouldn't forget that if you hear some of the stories around the units, it's like, holy fuck. There's a story of my unit, with guys carrying guys hundreds of meters to get to a medical position through fire. And you're like, well, it's great to celebrate, these guys on the pinnacle in the SAS commandos, but end of the day, these guys are just fucking awesome shit too. We all still bleed the same. A bullet does the exact same to me as it does to you, as to anyone.
Oh, you're spot on. And I think this is another trap. We spoke about social media and just seeing what you want to see and what they want you to see on social media, and creating this false impression of what's going on. And I think the same thing happens with special forces, and I think we lose sight of the fact that anyone who ends up in one of those units has started at another unit. Like, they're the same fucking people. They've just done a course and got a bit more training. It's not like they've somehow been bred differently. They've just got a slightly different mission profile. But exactly as you say, that difference between a Australian infantry element and a special operations element is not significant at all. I mean, it's a different mission profile, a couple of different skill sets, some different kit, but in terms of measuring the blokes against one another, the difference would be trivial. And like you say, when the chips are down, shit, I'd happily be out on the ground with either a bunch of grunts or a bunch of sass dudes. It's sort of inconsequential. You'd end up with the same caliber of bloke fighting on the ground, in my opinion.
And Aussies have shown that. Throughout the ages, Aussies again and again and again. Of course they have. Every fucking time you're like, holy shit! Like, you guys are fucking crazy. Especially in the jungle, fucking Aussies. And I think sometimes a lot of guys tend to lose a bit of morale because they do undersell themselves. Like, it's it's important to realise, if you look at other armies around the world, like, I know, doing a bit of work with the Marines, like, fuck, we're lucky, some of the training and kit and everything, like, a basic infantryman has. I remember rocking up as a SIG attached to a marine element.
Yeah.
And they thought, and they're like, oh, are you SF? And I'm like, no. And they're like, oh, but you've got double night vision and this body armor. And I'm like, oh, no. And they're like, oh, fuck that, you're lucky. Yeah. And I think we Australians, as general soldiers, fuck, we're kitted out well.
Yeah.
And the training, everything.
I think you're exactly right. And I think the caliber, it's the same as we've been talking about earlier with the perspective and what you're used to and calibrated towards. But I think the caliber of an Australian infantry soldier, when you look at it compared to the like forces of a lot of international nations, is right up there. You know, our grunts are right up there with the best of them.
Fucking oath. And probably one of the things I want to go over, and this is up to you whether we go or not, is sort of the most hectic tactical sort of medical scenario you've been put into.
Yeah.
And you know, whether the person, you know, ended up surviving or passing or but sort of what went down.
Yeah, I mean, there was...
Or one that's really in your like that you really remember.
Probably the most memorable was the first fatality that we had that I was on the ground for, and was sort of the guy responsible for the medical response to. And that one happened, so we'd inserted on a target, and this was during my second tour of Afghanistan, and it was a known enemy stronghold, basically. Like we'd sort of, our task was to go in there and soften up this target and just try and make it vulnerable for another force to come in and sweep through this village, because they hadn't been able to penetrate in there. And so the goal was to go in and fight for 48 hours. So we'd insert one period of darkness and stay on the ground for 2 days, insert extract the 48 hours later. And we were working with the 160th, so the US Special Operations Aviation Regiment. So they put us in, and because we'd assumed that the second we hit the deck we were going to get lit up, and that was exactly what happened. So we'd planned it to land pretty close to this village, and there was a whole bunch of desert around it, and they put us in within about 200 meters of the village, and so we inserted 1 a.m, midnight, whatever else, middle of the night, and within about 15 seconds of hitting the deck, we had machine gun fire just pouring into our position, RPGs cracking overhead, and there was a fair bit of open ground between us and the village, and it was make best.
200 meters, you pricks.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that it was Michael Johnson that holds the 200 meter world record.
It's now Dan Pronk.
Well, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there was a platoon of blokes that broke that record that night with body armor on, but. Yeah. But no, we zipped into the sort of perimeters there and made our way into the village, and we had these designated compounds of interest and sort of fought our way in. And on that particular night, we had a couple of minor casualties, nothing significant. I think an RPG airburst over a couple of blokes, and there was some fragmentation, minor stuff. But we were pretty lucky. I think from memory, a bloke had a plate strike that night as well, but certainly no significant injuries. And anyway, there was a little bit of a lull at sort of 2, 3, 4 a.m. and then first light, it was go time. The whole village erupted on that first day, and spent that entire day just in a massive gunfight. Had a couple of Predator drones overhead all day, and Apache gunships, lots of gun runs, and lots of probing attacks from the enemy, but just basically a big sort of gunfight all day. No casualties that day. Middle of summer in Afghanistan, the temperatures were sort of mid to high 40s, and so we kind of had underestimated the fight that we were getting ourselves into, and we depleted our ammunition stores. Well, we hadn't depleted them, but we were running low on ammo, and we were there for a whole nother 24 hours, and we were running low on water actually as well. And so that night we had a C-130, a Hercules, come in, fly super low, and kick out a bunch of pallets of ammo and water. And so we resupplied in the night, and and then once again the following day. And it turns out that the Taliban, they'd reinforced during the night as well. So they, through their Kharez systems, their underground systems, a bunch of other fighters had come in from out of town and reinforced. And we had also, there was a commando element in vehicles that had been on a different job, sort of not too far from where we were, and we'd realised that we'd kicked a bit of a hornet's nest, and so got in touch. The headquarters element got in touch and said, "Hey, do you reckon you guys can just come and set yourself up on the perimeter of this village and provide a bit of fire support?" And so they did just that. And so when it dawned, when day dawned the second day, and the gunfight started again, we had this a whole platoon of armoured vehicles sort of on the periphery of town. We were surrounded, which sounds far more dramatic than it was, but we were well fortified in our compounds, but we were getting attacked from every angle. And then there was this semicircle of armoured vehicles sort of shooting in, we were shooting out, and so it was sort of, and then we had the Apaches and the drones doing their runs as well. And so it was a real good, honest sort of shit fight. And on that second day, we started to take a few more significant casualties. So we had a couple of guys that were they were hit by a grenade, and they had some significant shrapnel wounds, one through the arms, the other down the side of his flank and his chest. And so I'd assessed those blokes, and we medically evacuated both of those, because I thought that they might have, I just didn't know whether the one in the chest had gone into the chest cavity, and the one on the arm, it was suspiciously close to a couple of arteries. So we got them out. Pretty shortly after that, a bloke copped a bullet in his vest, so he got hit square in the chest and was pretty lucky to get away with that. And then there was an RPG fragmentation wound. Another guy got a big chunk blown out of the front of his shin, and it fractured his shin. And we evacuated that guy.
By evacuation, what is that seen at the time? Is that airlifted out?
Yes.
Or by, yep.
Yeah. So called in some aeromedical evacuation helicopters, so Black Hawks, to come in with Apache escorts. Yep. And so it was pretty dodgy getting those birds in. And I
was going to say,
to their credit, the AME crews, I never had an experience where they didn't come.
Were they Yank PJs in them?
They weren't PJs. So we did have, I mean, the PJs, pararescue jumpers, were certainly flying AME missions and CSAR type stuff in Afghanistan. But on that particular day, it was dust off. So regular Army aeromedical evacuation platforms in Black Hawks. And so we'd had Apaches do gun runs and just sort of suppress the targets, and then they'd come sort of screaming in and flare and slam down, and we'd chuck our casualties on, and they'd nick off. And I've actually got helmet camera footage of one of the handovers. It was for the two grenade blokes, and normally the flight medic would hop off the bird and sort of come and get a handover, and you know, you'd try and give him a bit of information. And that was on that day, watching it back, as the dodgiest handover I ever got. That bloke wasn't getting off the helicopter. They just sort of slammed this thing in. We chucked the blokes off. I yelled at him at 2 sentences, and then they were off. Yeah. They didn't want to stick around. But so we'd done all that, and come early afternoon, sort of mid-afternoon, actually it was, we'd had an element move forward. We'd been getting fairly heavily engaged from a couple of machine gun positions, which were about 150 metres in front of kind of our forward line of our troops, if you like, and the position I was in, and one of our platoon headquarters was in. And there was a 4-man patrol that moved forward to try and clear those positions. And they'd been engaged as they moved forward. They were moving along a creek line. They'd been engaged. They'd shot back. They'd dropped one of the enemy and wounded another, and they were following that wounded enemy. So they were following a blood trail into this enemy series of compounds where there was the machine gun positions, and they ended up moving forward. And sadly, the lead bloke initiated a massive IED, so he stood on a device, and it went up and shrapned one of the other guys fairly badly, and then blew up the other two guys of the patrol quite badly as well. And in the confusion of it all, the other two blokes that had been blown eardrums and sort of knocked off their feet, but otherwise not injured, had gotten up. There was a guy who had significant shrapnel wounds to his neck, and he was conscious and making a bit of noise, and they'd dragged him back into a compound and then regrouped and realised that the fourth bloke wasn't with them, had gone out under heavy fire and recovered him and dragged him back. And the bloke who actually went out and grabbed him ended up with a Medal of Gallantry for that, because he exposed himself to heavy gunfire to recover his wounded mate. Dragged him back. We had realised that something had gone wrong, and the radio calls came through that they had a significant casualty or casualties. So I plugged into a quick reaction force, about half a dozen blokes, plugged in with them, and we moved forward to where they were. So we were about 150 metres dislocated from our elements. The enemy knew that we were pinned down. They knew we had casualties, some of which were significant. And so we had got back into this compound and sort of set up a roof team and the roof team was immediately engaged. And so the enemy was trying to get in, and we were trying to desperately stabilise the two blokes that were the worst injured. The one that initiated the device was very, very badly injured, and the other guy had these neck wounds that were bleeding quite badly. And at this stage, the light was starting to fade, so it was sort of getting a bit darker. We were dislocated from our enemy, from the element. The enemy were probing us. We had this really critically injured guy and another guy fairly badly injured, and it was just a really tough situation. And ultimately, despite our best efforts, we were losing the guy who initiated the device, and he started to lose signs of life, and so we started initiating higher order resuscitative measures, which I guess in my heart of hearts I knew was futile, and ultimately had to make the decision that this situation was deteriorating rapidly. We'd called an aeromedical evacuation platform, and it was in a holding pattern, and it was running out of fuel, so it was going bingo. And we had a time pressure to get our guys who we could put on the AME bird to the extraction site. We were very aware that the enemy was moving in on us, and saw this as an opportunity for us to attack us as a dislocated element with bogged down with a couple of casualties. And so ultimately I had to make the decision to cease our resuscitative efforts of the bloke who initiated the device, who really, in that context, there was no saving him, sadly. He was just too badly damaged. And just package him up, turn our attention to the other three blokes, and just make sure we all fell back safely and didn't sustain any more casualties, got back to our element, and then evacuated the other guys. And that was one where it was the first time I had been I'd been a doctor for a while at that point, and I'd been involved in resuscitations where people had died, but it was almost universally, I was part of a team. I wasn't the team leader. It was a civilian context where the person dying was a stranger. And so you can remove yourself from that. That's easy, relatively speaking, to remove yourself emotionally from. But this was the first time where I was the guy everyone was looking to do the business. This bloke was a friend of mine that was loved and respected amongst that community. He was a legend amongst that community, and I didn't, it was on me, and I didn't have the skill set to be able to deal with that, or I couldn't resolve that situation. I went through my processes and they just weren't working, and so that was a tough one to sort of rationalize in my mind, and that was one that really played on loop for for years, to be honest with you. And then sort of sadly within 6 weeks of that, I sort of found myself in the field for another 2 blokes getting killed, another one that I'd worked on for about 40 minutes, and then a third one who was killed instantly, but we had to recover his body, so we didn't do any medical interventions on him. But it was just this really rough period for the task group as a whole, and for myself personally, that just really redefined how I saw the role and redefined. It was formative for me professionally and personally. With hindsight, it was a real turning point for me.
Yeah. Does it ever? Because I know even I have little bits like this, and of course I've never lived through anything like that. Looking back on things like that, does it ever feel like that didn't exist? Like now you're in such a civilian life, you know, you're back in Adelaide with wife and kids, and you're sitting here with me, and we're having. Do you ever look back and think, fuck, no, surely not? Like, I think back, and it's only a few years back to Afghan, and whatever. I'm like, nah, I'm such a different person now than then. That wasn't, like, it almost seemed like a dream that didn't actually happen. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah. It absolutely. Sometimes I sort of catch myself thinking about it, and it's more like a movie that I watched than something I actually experienced. And I guess for years afterwards, I would have a physical response to those memories. My palms would sweat, my heart would go, and all those typical sort of things. And but then that went away, and then, you know, the years pass, and you go from thinking about it multiple times a day and you know, dreaming about it and all the rest, to not having any response when you do think about it, to then realizing, shit, I haven't thought about that for 6 weeks, you know? And so, I mean, which is great. It's part of the normal healing process. But yeah, you're quite right. I in my day-to-day life today, it is so far removed from any of that stuff. I look at photos of myself then, and I hardly recognize myself. And I think about those situations, and the thought of being in combat is just so foreign to me now that it is almost like that was, like I said, a movie that I watched or a dream that I had, rather than something I actually did.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it, that you can live sort of different lives, and it's so taken away from it. Like right now, we couldn't be further away from that, and yet somewhere in the world that's happening. Like, but I think it is important to open and close chapters of life, and you know, you don't forget those chapters, of course, but you know, you got to. I'm not saying move on, but at some point you move forward with life. You know, it still exists, it still matters. You just got to move on through it.
I like the concept of evolving, and I think it's, you're never going to forget that sort of stuff, and you shouldn't. No. However, you shouldn't dwell on it or live in the past, because there's no future there. And I've come to look at this from the perspective of the blokes who did die, who I worked on and I couldn't save. And I honestly believe that they wouldn't want me to sit around feeling sorry for myself or feeling bad for them. You know, they just weren't that kind of blokes. Just like,
but I think none of you guys are that kind of guy.
No, that's exactly right.
If you died, you'd be like, lads, get over it. Go have a beer for me, and then fuck off.
Spot on. And I'm sure that's your sentiment exactly. You know, I mean, it was a great sort of experience to live through the passing of my dad, which is a weird thing to say, but I mean, we were lucky with Dad. He had lung cancer, and so we had a period of time there where we knew that he was dying, but had the chance to process that. It wasn't a sudden death. And, you know, Dad was a very philosophical sort of bloke, and not particularly religious, but well, not religious at all, actually, in any sense of the term. But he was very sort of, you know, cut and dry. He was a heavy smoker his whole life, and it was sort of logical to him. Yep, I smoked, now I have cancer, and I'm going to die. But our family was very lucky in the way that we had very open lines of communication. We were very aware that we respected each other. We spoke to each other often. We told each other we loved them. There was nothing left unsaid. And so I guess with Dad, he was very adamant that he didn't want his death to be this tragic event. He wanted his funeral to be a celebration of his life rather than a mourning of his death. And that's exactly what it was. It was this overwhelmingly positive experience, his funeral. It was this sort of, what an amazing opportunity to show gratitude to everything that this man had done to everyone for everyone in the room. And so it was just this sort of fantastic celebration of his contribution to all of our lives, and sort of just sending him on to the next world rather than, oh, this is horrible, he's gone. And coming back to the guys that died in the field, they were true warriors, and they loved every second of doing what they did. There was nowhere they would have rather been, and to be killed in that role was a reality of what they were doing. They knew that, and we all knew that. I suppose whether you know it in theoretically and then you actually really know it, it's probably two different things. However, the fact remains that they weren't the kind of blokes that would have felt sorry for themselves, and I don't think they were the sort of blokes that would have expected anyone responding to them to do their absolute best, which we did. However, if it didn't work out well, then they wouldn't have wanted us to dwell on that. They would have wanted us to I think move on with our lives and live a full life that sort of honoured their sacrifice rather than just mourning it. And by that same token, I mean, when I look at the horrendous injuries that bloke that I was talking about had sustained, and talking to close mates of his after the fact, it would have been a very different life and a very challenging life, and for him to live and so far removed from the high functioning, sort of physically vital bloke that he was, that whether he would have wanted to go on as that person, it's hard to say. But anyway,
it's another world, isn't it? It's the life of an SAS trooper, right? But I don't think anyone ends up in that role not coming to the realization of, well, that's part of this job. You're dealing with life and death on both sides, I guess, so flippantly. At the same token, that you guys have gone into a village, or a compound where life and death is so apparent, ending, and and I guess in your life, the life and death you've seen has made you who you are. The biggest thing I get from your book, and knowing you, as a personal mate of mine, is you reiterate everything about family. It's throughout everything. And I think part of the post-traumatic growth, to a degree, is you've dealt with death so much that you appreciate life so much. And I think it's a truly beautiful moment when you were saying you're at the front of that, and we talked about earlier in this, out the front of a restaurant with your newly born child, and and I think almost the seeing death makes you appreciate life more. And that's it's sort of that you need that. It's the dark backing that makes a mirror, show you who you are.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and I think we spoke about it earlier, that strange, almost paradoxical sounding statement that those horrendous experiences are your best ones, but it's very true in that it does take your blinkers off with regards to appreciating what you've got. And I'm now in a position where I'm just so gracious towards my wife, my family, and just appreciative of this, what I've got there, and my life in general, my role in society, my job. They're all gifts that were previously assumed, but now I really appreciate. And I think that's, to have your eyes open to that is a really it is a gift.
I think opening your eyes to your own, well, mortality in general
Yeah.
does a lot. I know my own, sort of opening my eyes to mortality of my own has made me love a lot more. Like you mentioned with your family, nothing goes unsaid. I tell a lot more people I love them now than I ever did. I hug a lot more people than I ever hugged.
Yeah.
And it's honestly made me a fucking better person.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
There's a lot of the
hard.
peripheral bullshit in life that just falls away when you're sort of faced with those realizations. You sort of think all the stuff you used to think was important is really not, and it allows you to focus on the stuff that actually is important.
Yeah, and one of the ways I look at it, sort of finding happiness in because I struggled, and I think a lot of people do, to live in the now. We tend to live in the past or the future.
Yeah.
That things will get better in the future, or they were better in the past instead of now. I refer back to a lot of an author, Sam Harris. He's a neuroscientist and an astrophysicist. Anyway, he does a lot of work on like finding meaning in life if you're not spiritual at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, he talks about sort of the basic, very, very basic things of like quantum physics. Says that pretty much anything we can interact with exists for you and me. Right here, you and me cannot prove anything outside this room exists. And he calls them frames of reference.
Yep.
And he talks about to find happiness in a moment is you need to break that frame of reference. So no matter what's happening in your or my life, I might have stresses that I'm going to see a doctor somewhere. And he goes, break that frame of reference. And if you think of a frame of reference on a universal, like a universe size, you're not smart enough to. You think on a global size, it'll annoy you because you'll think of everything from global warming and what's happening in Afghan now and in Syria. And you break it down to your community, then you might break it down that you're not enjoying it. Break it down to the point of like the most private moment you're having. So break your frame of reference down. So right now, it's Willy and Dan. That should not right here, right now. Nothing outside of this room exists in the world.
Yeah,
and that's how he talks about it. And the funny thing is, there's actually a lot of science to back up that. But to break that down, and I think a lot of those key moments you were talking about, that the most terrible moments can almost be in the best one. That if you're there, doing resuscitation with a mate of yours who makes it, doesn't make it, at that moment, at that second in time, nothing else existed for you and him.
Yeah.
To you, he was the most important person in your life, and to him, you were as well.
Yep.
Yes, there's bullets flying around, but at that moment, it's you guys.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And this sort of circles back to that whole flow state and that in the zone, if you like. And as much as I refer to those situations as being terrible, and they were, the outcome was terrible, my feeling at the time was not one of terror or fear or sort of profound sadness. It was, I was at that exactly as you said, I was so engaged in the moment and so absolutely in that zone that they were actually really, for me personally, quite sort of, I guess, well, stimulating in a way, but very calm experiences of flowing through my processes, doing my procedures. It was almost on autopilot, just kind of going through there. And there was a lot of other examples that I experienced over there where I did go into this strange, calm state where there was a lot of stuff going on around me, a lot of noise, a lot of gunfire, casualties and all the rest of it. But my world went really calm and quiet, and a couple of times where my world slowed, I lost perspective of time, which is, once again, they talk about this, what they call hypofrontality, where different circuits in your brain start to slow down and shut down, and you go into that flow state and lose track of self and time and all the rest of it. And so you're exactly right. Those experiences are very rich for a lot of reasons. I mean, they're very engaging, and in that exact moment, nothing outside of that sort of 1 square meter around me mattered or existed. And thank goodness there was someone up on the roof worrying about people trying to come into our compound or shoot at us, because I certainly wasn't thinking about that, and I was consumed in that moment. And that happened a number of times in Afghanistan, and it was for me, they were very positive experiences to have. but the outcome of the situations was often very negative. And so, you know, when you come out of that and look back, you think, geez, that was a bad day. However, I didn't feel bad in that situation, and that in itself can create a bit of kind of confusion, because there's been situations where there's been a horrendous outcome in a medical scenario, a couple I can think of with local nationals, where the outcome was poor and people died. However, I'd gone through processes that were professionally satisfying for me and were a challenge to my skill set and went well in certain casualties, whereas others didn't. And so, I mean, the end result was a bad one. There was lots of dead people at the end of the day, but I walked away from it thinking, gee, that was awesome. And then you sort of think, who are you? Like, how can you walk away from that situation thinking you've had a good day when all these, and so it creates confusion there. But so, yeah, I mean, it I guess takes time to process all of that stuff.
It's a weird thing. And how do you deal with in a civilian, like in Australia with death now as a doctor?
Look, I mean, I guess you get pretty comfortable with the concept as a whole. I had the opportunity when I was working up at that little hospital up in Queensland to do a fair bit of palliative care. So we had an inpatient facility, a ward facility, and a couple of the beds were palliative beds. And I found myself really enjoying that work. I hadn't ever expected to. I had no exposure to it. It was so far removed from what I'd loved prior to that, which was the tactical medicine, the sort of pointy end, point of injury, big injuries, test your skills against these dying people. But then I found myself in this environment with these end stage cancer patients, you know, the people in their late phase of their life. But that was a really privileged position to be invited into that, what is a very, very intimate family dynamic, and then to be able to negotiate that both with the patient and sort of negotiate with them as to what their expectations are, what the medical reality is, what you can and can't do, and then the family as a broader construct, all of which bring their individual opinions, and the family dynamics are always massively amplified when you're in these sort of situations, and so to be a doctor as in the middle of all of that was a really unique experience, and I found a very gratifying one if you could do it well. And so, in terms of my view on death from that perspective, to be able to facilitate some of these patients like a painless and dignified death was a real privilege and a positive experience for me in that regard. I still see certain deaths as tragic. You still see, little kids taken before their time, or horrible accidents, or whatever else, and that's a tragedy. There's no two ways about it. I haven't been desensitized to the fact that death is a tragic thing in certain situations. However, I certainly don't view deaths like I mentioned my father passed away a couple of years ago, and that didn't sadden me profoundly, which might sound a bit callous, but that was for the fact that he'd lived a full life, and we had that time towards the end of his life. Although if he had died quicker, and I mentioned this in my book, I don't think it would have mattered, because there was nothing that was left unsaid. He knew that I loved him, I knew that he loved me, and we had this fantastic relationship. He had lived to a point where he'd seen both his sons grow up and establish themselves, have families of their own. He'd met his grandkids, and he'd set my mum up for the rest of her life. So he'd done his part, and I would have loved for him to kick on for another 20 years, no two ways about it. But the fact that he passed at that age, he'd lived a full life, and so I didn't view that as sad. And so for those sort of grandparents dying and elderly dying, I don't see that as particularly sad. But yeah, like I said, I haven't been completely desensitized to the tragedy of young people dying.
Of course, and I think that reacted a little bit with myself. A lot of people go, "Oh, how can you be, so okay and happy with your prognosis diagnosis?" And I'm like, well, no, and I'm not shitting you. If I were to, step outside tonight and get run over by a fucking bus, no shit. Yes, there's goals I want to achieve. Fucking oath there are. But I feel like I've done a lot, and this is, like you said, affects me with young people, is I look at these kids in a chemo clinic or something, I'm like, you've never had sex, you've never travelled Europe, you've never had a job, you've never been to school, that's what gets to me about that. And I think I'm so happy with my own mortality that I'm almost, and I think if you're not at the stage where you're like, well, look, if I died tomorrow, I'm pretty fucking happy with what I've done. I'm not saying there's not things we burn to do, like you mentioned, and you mentioned the book that you saw on a Skilled Athlete shirt first. The comfort is a slow death.
Yes,
of course. I think you should always be, sort of got that fire burning to do next things. And I say with guys like yourself, you'll be 85 in a palliative care in a hospital bed, going, yeah, but I want to still do this, eh? And I think that's just human nature for people. But you need to look back on big events and be like, yeah, well, I've done it. And that's why I hate bucket lists. I get goals. I hate bucket lists. I think if you want to skydive, there's nothing stopping an Adelaide person to go to Lower Light Skydive tomorrow with Alan and go jump out of a fucking plane. Same with if you want to go to France, go, because the way Sam Harris puts it is every human knows we are one drive, one hospital visit, one something of either dying or getting told we're dying. We know that's coming. We don't know when, but we know it is coming. So if you do know that, then, don't be silly with your time.
Oh, I think, you're exactly right. And I mean, even if you don't know that, don't be silly with your time, I think. And I suppose it's that happy medium. You hear those kind of mantras, live every day as if it was your last type thing, which is unrealistic.
Yeah, exactly.
You'd go and clear out your bloody bank account.
You'd be broke.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you'd wake up the next day not dead.
It'd be a fucking big night for us.
With a McLaren in the car park that you don't know how the
good day, but
how the fuck to pay off. But I guess by that same token, spending your days dwelling on things that happened 9 years ago or living that victim mentality, why me type thing, you're missing that opportunity to make the most of what you've got left if there is an ultimatum somewhere there. But like you said, ultimately we're all dying. It's just a matter of time, and whether it happens suddenly or gradually over a period, life's precious. You can't get it back. And so trying to make the most out of each of those days, being present, is something I'm very aware of, particularly with my kids, having missed a lot of their early years when I was away. Not dragging any of my bullshit from work home to sort of take out on them, having those transitions where I might have had a bad day at work, which is pretty rare these days, to be honest. I'm very lucky, but driving home and thinking, well, who's the best version of myself that needs to walk through that door? And even if I've got something on my mind, sort of stopping to think before I get in the door and see my kids and my wife, well, hang on a sec, it's I don't want to drag this into my house with me. I need to just leave this mood here and snap into being the dad that my kids want me to be when I walk through that door, the husband that my wife wants me to be when I walk through that door, and just that mindfulness, if you like, and that ability to be present and to consciously transition and be the best version of yourself for whatever the situation dictates is a massive thing for me. And it's been a huge positive in my life over the last couple of years to just gain that skill.
Yeah, and that's a very powerful statement. Sort of not drag on shit with you. Like, that person was an asshole to you in the street, he's not at home with you and your kids. And I think living in that moment is something it's not easy to do. But it is something I've really been trying to do more and more, is get purely in, like, living you and me. And then if I go out later for someone with coffee, it's me and them. Like, why bother with other shit? And you'll be a lot happier for that moments of time. You'll be fucking way happier.
Yeah.
So it's nearing the end of this. We're 2 hours and 50 8 minutes in now.
Bloody hell, mate.
Yeah, I know.
Time flies.
Yeah, fucking oath it does. What's next for yourself? Where do you see in the next coming years?
Yeah.
As far as career, professionally, anything?
It's a fair question. So the role I'm currently in is a medical management role. So I've moved not completely away from clinical, but I've embraced more of the managerial side of medicine, which has created a new set of challenges. And I guess I have felt and do feel the need to constantly evolve, if you like. I mentioned that term earlier, but I like to challenge myself. I don't like to get too comfortable for too long in a particular role. And so this, over the past few years, I've been developing that managerial skill set as it applies to medical services, and so I've enjoyed that challenge. And the current role I'm doing, I'm almost 2 years into it, and so I'm still on that learning curve there. So there's still some good stuff there to work through. I've got a couple of entrepreneurial side projects, which one of which I can't talk about in great detail because I haven't finalized all the intellectual property for, but that one's about to go loud. I've been working. Yeah, I've been working for 2 years on that.
Oh, Jesus.
And I've got the first, actually sitting on my desk at home, the first finalized pre-production prototype of this device that we've been working on. And so for anyone who's sort of has a look at my Instagram once in a while, that'll pop up on that sometime soon, as I've secured that.
I'm fucking excited now.
Oh, yeah, so am I. I wish I could talk more about it, but
no, that's fine. Just means you've got to come back in a couple of months.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'd love to. And the other one so I've been working on a car project for a long time, which I sort of have put out in the public space. I've founded this company many years ago, which is building a prototype sports car.
Yep.
And so it is moving along slowly but surely. And so that keeps me very engaged from an entrepreneurial perspective, those two projects. TACMed is doing wonderful things. So that's moving ahead nicely. And we've sort of split off a sister company called Payon Medical, which is doing medical services, which is starting to grow. And then we've moved into virtual reality. And so Jeremy, the founder, has been very proactive in developing a first responder virtual reality training program. And so that's starting to gain some traction as well. So there's a whole bunch in that space that's incredibly interesting for me as well. And so, I've got this very happy mix of my current work, which is engaging in the medical management space, and then these entrepreneurial side projects in very different things, and then still that engagement in the tactical medical piece with TACMed. So it's a good round, and then of course my family, and that keeps me pretty busy. So that's me for right now. As to where it all heads, it'll depend on the success or otherwise of some of this entrepreneurial ventures, to be honest.
Yeah, well, fucking, I would say fingers crossed for you, but it's a hard work thing, and I'm sure it's been fucking put in.
We'll see. Yeah,
I'm fucking excited to see.
Yeah. Either way, I mean, coming back to what we said earlier, these were thoughts that I had and plans that I made many years ago, and the one of which is sort of after 2 years coming to fruition to the point where I'll be able to put it out on the market, and either it'll take off or it'll flop. One or two things, but I won't look back in 10 years thinking, oh, I wonder if I could have. And then the car is almost like my new sort of SAS selection project. It's gonna drag on for probably the best part of a decade. But
fuck, do you have a name? Do you have a name for the car yet?
I do, mate. Yeah, so Delta Automotive Industries is the company, and the car, the prototype's called the Ligero. So Delta Ligero is
it better than your Lambo?
Well, I don't know. How do you find better? The Lambo's in the shop at the moment, so we'll wait and see what that costs. But it'll be faster than the Lambo. Yeah,
that classifies enough for me.
All right. Yep. Better then.
I'm secretly like a fucking 10-year-old boy when it comes to cars.
Oh, we all are.
I'm like, as long as it sounds good and it's quick, I'm set.
Yep.
Easy. Well, look, to be honest, I think we're done. Unless there's anything else you want to go over, like.
I think that covers it, mate.
Yeah, I think that covers it all. And honestly, mate, I can't tell you how much I appreciate.
Pleasure.
And not only the you coming in tonight to, you know, be on my podcast, but, you know, the behind the scenes stuff as well of, you know, what was it? It'd almost be 18 months ago now when, you know, I knew of you. I had no idea who you were. Next thing I tagged in a video of you, like, let's support this bloke. And I can't, at that point in my life, I honestly can't tell you how much that meant to me. You know, that's a pretty fucking low point. And in the same day, I had guys like, I probably had like 20 operators, like you know, well-known guys, all hit me up, yourself included, and no shit, that fucking lifted a lot off me. Thinking, well, fuck, it's not only me, you know, with support, it's everyone.
Oh, awesome, mate. Gee, that's thank you for saying that.
No, I still look back at that. I watched it actually yesterday. I watched that video of yourself in, what do you call your bar? The Blue
Voodoo Lounge.
The Blue Voodoo Lounge.
Yeah.
I only yesterday looked back at that and I'm like, holy fuck. That was a fucking turning point in my life of like, shit. And then I know my Instagram sort of got some traction off yours, like piggybacked off yours. And I was like, fuck, like almost now I feel a bit responsible to keep this going for people. Like, honestly, I sound like I'm blowing smoke up your ass, but I can't appreciate it. You more coming in and speaking openly and, you know, behind the scenes shit.
It's an absolute pleasure. And it's great to engage. And we spoke about it earlier, and I suppose these false impressions you get of people online, and I'm no different. I just put up some shit that people perceive as whatever they want. You know what I'm saying? And at the end of the day, we all sit down to shit, and it was fantastic for me to be able to reach out to yourself, and I look to you as a true inspiration. I mean, holy shit, and talking about, we have our bad days. I mean, and I don't have many these days. Like I said before, I'm kind of looking at life from a different perspective. But fucking hell, mate, I look at your situation and look at your positivity in the face of what's going on, and I'm in awe, mate. That's incredible.
Oh, so, mate, trust me, it means a fucking lot to me having someone
it's huge.
Someone like you say it to myself. I don't see it. I honestly, man, just doing what I can, you know. And I think a lot of people almost give me too much credit for what I do. Like at the same point, we talked about this earlier, that, you know, a lot of what I do, yes, it may be helping people, but it helps me. Yeah. You know, these charity fundraising, and although of course it's something I believe in 100%, it helps me know that, well, look, I might not have been able to achieve in my life what I've wanted, but my legacy of this will continue on. Yep. So and my whole thing is that like 100 years down the 50, 100 years down the track, I want someone to take their kid in and they've got a fucking astrocytoma in the brain. Yep. And like, the doctor goes, oh, well, actually we have this drug that does this. And then I don't even care if they think it, but at some point, this fuckhead flipping tires down Semaphore Beach had some contribution to that. And that's honestly enough for me. Like that's it.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a big deal. And I think you're on that trajectory. I mean, the way that tire flip gained traction internationally was phenomenal. So,
well, I'm starting filming early next week for it again. It'll be out late next week. It'll be out to go again late October.
Brilliant.
So it should be epic.
Good on you. I think what you're starting here is something huge.
Yeah, we'll see how we go.
Excellent.
So Dan again, and everyone else, especially actually for those who dropped in live, there were people who watched the whole thing like 3 and a bit of hours.
Yeah, bloody hell, that's hard work.
That is hard work. Fucking oath.
Go to bed, guys.
Go have a drink. We're all going to the bullshit. So Dan, thank you so much, brother.
Pleasure.
You're a legend. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.
So for everyone listening for the podcast on either Spotify, Google Podcast, and especially those on YouTube or live watching, thank you so much. This was episode 15 with Dan Pronk, a hero of mine, should be a hero of yours. So cheers and thanks again.
Cheers, guys.
And